Okay, welcome back. I hope you're all refreshed after lunch and ready for this session on poetry. I'm handing over straight away to Dr. Stephen Cranfield to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Jane. And we were expecting, or we hopefully are expecting, Dr. Julio Crespo McLennan from the Instituto Cervantes in London to introduce Alvaro. I think what we'll do is that we will plough ahead, and if Julio does arrive, hopefully before the end of the session, we will invite Julio onto the stage to kind of like retrospectively introduce and welcome Alvaro. The Instituto has funded Alvaro's trip to London. Now, this session is I suppose it's an opportunity to show you translation at work, in the work of a particular poet, Alvaro Fierro, who is here on the platform with us. Now, Alvaro, as you can see from his biography in the conference program, has a very interesting background, having worked in industrial engineering and having coming into the poetry scene during the 80s and 90s, and being quite involved, particularly in digital poetry, where he helped to set up an Aquelu website and was the poetry editor for that, and has been actually involved in bringing poets together in order to share online and face-to-face. And he first developed, I suppose, his poetic voice from the late 80s, early 90s, with a series of collections that have appeared fairly regularly over the years, and latterly they've been mixed with prose works, works for children, and some critical works. And he's also now a regular columnist to an online magazine called Ediciones, which he contributes to in its cultural pages. This is me and Claudio Tedesco, his co-translator, first came across Alvaro's work, I'd say about 2 years ago, and we've worked collaboratively with Alvaro over that time, mostly long distance with the occasional telephone call, but it's mostly been through email. A very kind of unusual, strange relationship for people who are interested in poetry, because so much you think depends on the sound of the poetry, how the person sort of speaks it. And if you've got a living poet just kind of a stone's throw away, why shouldn't you speak to him? But circumstances have meant that busy lives and everything, we've conducted most of our communications electronically, and this is the first time, in fact, not today, but yesterday, that Claudio and I met Alvaro. So I'm glad that we've all survived the experience, and that we are very pleased to be able to share with you today the kind of fruits of our labours so far. Alvaro is going to present a range of his poems, and we're going to read some of the English translations, some of which have appeared in print. And he's going to intersperse them with comments, and I'm going to try and kind of give a kind of overall theme to the presentation, but I hope that will be discreet, and most of the time we'll be listening to Alvaro and the translations, and then there'll be time for Q&A afterwards. So without more ado, I'm going to invite Alvaro to come onto the platform. He will read his work from here, and I will kind of recite from down there. So I'd like you to welcome Alvaro Fierro.
Thank you, Stephen. Good afternoon. Las páginas que todavía no has escrito son tu exilio. Y allí vives pensando cuántas vidas te harán falta para conocerte, cuántas vidas para escribirte solo un poco.
The pages which you haven't yet written are your exile, and there you live, thinking how many lives you'll need to know thyself, how many lives to write yourself just a little. I should have added that we've got some poems in the conference pack, which you're welcome to follow as we go along, and to scrutinise particularly Claudio's and my translations, and we're always welcome to share your thoughts on that after we go along. But in the first kind of section of the reading, and picking up particularly from that theme that came across this morning from discussing Goitisolo's work, particularly about how every person, I suppose, carries a sense of exile within them, regardless of whether they're in that particular context of a different country or not. there's something about, I suppose, contemporary culture which forces us to reflect on, where do we fit in, where do we feel at home? And as Peter was saying, even for his mother, who was born and grew up in an area of the country where we would say, well, she's native. She isn't. She didn't feel like that. So in these first poems, when I asked Alvaro to think about this particular theme of displacement and kind of like being pushed into a different paradigm of thinking about yourself, he chose 3 poems which are fairly characteristic recent poems, which look at, in particular, the way in which we start looking at things through different eyes when we're kind of forced, in a sense, to reflect on ourselves and what that means in terms of a kind of sense of displaced self. They're quite amusing, humorous poems, I hope you find, so we'll start off in what we hope is that kind of upbeat tone, and Alvaro is going to start.
I want to say just a few words. We do not have the right to complain about life, because we are among the luckiest people in the world, not only because we have been born in Western countries, but also because we have been born today, and we have plenty of things to be grateful. So I think, moreover, across life you also have to meet tough situations like sorrow or death or pain. So poetry has to reflect life, and poetry has to be a mixture of joy and of sadness as well, and exile, as Stephen said. I'm going to read the first poem. It's called Scherzo. The first scherzo ever was written by Beethoven for his Third Symphony. And he replaced the traditional minuetto, as in Mozart's and Haydn's symphonies, and he replaced it by a more cheerful and playful movement. But the musician that really succeeded in creating the scherzo was Felix Mendelssohn. So I tried to make some kind of a Mendelssohnian approach in this poem, Scherzo. Hoy quiero hablaros de mis manos. A veces, cuando estoy pelando una naranja o mientras le recuento las sílabas a un verso, me fijo en sus arrugas, en sus venas, en el destello de oro que me rodea el anular o en el reloj. No sé por qué lo llevo. Yo siempre llego tarde y los minutos son paraísos diminutos si no se lleva prisa. O en ese vello suave que las protege de las zarzas, desde que los abuelos de mi abuelo pintaron en el útero del mundo aquellos mitológicos bisontes. A veces, os decía, las observo, y sin que se percaten, cuando me dan la espalda, les digo que se sientan orgullosas, porque descienden de otras manos que levantaron templos y ciudades, allí donde tan solo había polvo. Allí en su tosquedad, en su eficiencia, cuando me rasco o me retiro una legaña, cierto deseo de agradarme. Saben que sé que cuando estoy dormido, sin que lo sienta apenas, se separan de mis brazos y buscan por el suelo todos esos poemas que vagan sin autor que se apiade de su música. Escogen los que saben que me agradan, los que cuentan la historia de algún pájaro que le fue infiel al aire y se quedó a vivir junto a una rosa, los que recuerdan a los muertos o a algún antiguo príncipe. Y cuando me despierto, cogen algún papel y dejan que me crea que yo soy el que escribe.
Scherzo. Today I want to talk to you about my hands. Sometimes, when I'm peeling an orange, or while I'm recounting the syllables in a verse, I stare at their wrinkles, their veins, at the gleam of gold that encompasses my ring finger, or at the watch. I've no idea why I wear the latter. I always arrive late, and minutes are heavens in miniature if you're not pushed for time. Or at that soft down that protects them from brambles, since the ancestors of my ancestor daubed in the world's womb those mythical bison. Sometimes, as I was saying, I observe them, and when they're off guard, with their backs turned to me, I tell them to stand proud, because they're descended from other hands that raised up temples and cities there where only dust was. In their coarseness, in their dexterity, when I scratch myself or pick sleep from my eyes, is a certain desire to please me. They know, I know, that when I'm asleep, without my hardly noticing, they part company from my arms and rummage on the floor, for all those poems that roam without an author who might take pity on their music. They choose the ones they know I'll like, those which relate the story of some bird that was unfaithful to the air and stayed to live by a rose's side, those which recall the departed or some prince of olden time. And when I awake, they grab a piece of paper and let me believe it's me who's the one writing.
The next poem was written in Vienna, in the National History Museum. I happened to enter in a room and I came across the Venus of Willendorf. It's a famous Neolithical statuette made of limestone, which I had studied long ago, and it has a kind of beauty which is not classical, because she has those enormous hips, because she represents fertility, or fertility, I don't know how to say it in English. So I wrote in front of her, Carta de amor a la Venus de Willendorf. Aunque estás hecha de caliza y eres gorda, aunque no quiso tu escultor ponerle rasgos a la belleza de tu rostro, ni te dio pies, no fuera a ser que te escaparas para comprarte unos zapatos en las rebajas de hace 25.000 años. Aunque tus pechos grandes hayan perdido la altivez que yo imagino que tuvieron cuando un recolector, junto al Danubio, dijo sobre tu piel que te quería, hoy tiene la amplitud de tus caderas cierta coquetería antigua que ha regresado de los tiempos esta mañana de noviembre, para que no se olvide que la caliza puede también enamorarse.
Love letters to the Venus of Willendorf. Even though you're made of limestone and you're fat, even though your sculptor didn't want to add features to the beauty of your face and didn't give you feet either, just in case you did a runner to buy yourself some pumps in the sales of 25,000 years ago, even though your big breasts have lost the hauteur which I imagine they had when a gatherer by the banks of the Danube said over your skin that he loved you, today the ampleness of your hips has a certain antique flirtatiousness that has returned with the centuries this November morning, lest one forget that limestone too can fall in love.
I think one of the main purposes of poetry is to enter into the reader's mind, right? Is to offer some kind of reasoning, of beliefs, of thoughts, and make him start thinking as if those thoughts have been thought by him. It's like some kind of supplanting the reader's mind. So it requires a complete lack of rhetoric, I think. Rhetoric has to be away from poetry. Unfortunately, it is very frequent to find many rhetorical poems. We are going to read a poem called, let me see the title, I Thought I Was Away. This has been included in a collection that was dedicated to several artworks that were exhibited in order to raise funds for building basins and wells in Kenya. Creí que estaba fuera. Para llegar hasta mí mismo, hasta lo que mi peso insiste en ser, atravieso los mapas que han dibujado en el cristal todos los rumbos de mis lágrimas. Al otro lado de la claridad, casi temblando, desprotegida de mi cuerpo, a la intemperie, sola, está la transparencia interponiéndose entre mis ojos y los mundos. Cuando pretendo no pensar, abandonarme a este silencio que ha atravesado la ventana, veo que soy los siglos, las ciudades, todas las músicas y sueños, los viajes, las plegarias que han producido en mi interior este momento.
I thought I was away. To arrive at myself, at what my burden insists on being, I traverse maps that all the courses of my tears have drawn on the panes. On the other side of the light, almost trembling, unprotected by my body, open to the elements, alone, is the translucency which comes between my eyes and the world's. When I try not to think and give myself up to this silence, which has passed through the window, I see that I am the centuries, cities, all the musics and dreams, the journeys, the prayers that have created in my core this moment.
This last poem was dedicated to a picture as the following, called Telarañas de Agua. Water cobwebs is Stevens and Claudia's translation. Telarañas de agua. Este momento en el que inicio una plegaria para pedir por mí, por todo lo que vuela y se emociona, lo que contiene una ventana, un Dios, una niñez que aflora cuando menos se espera, lo que transita por la desesperanza en busca de esperanza, lo que para soñar abre los brazos y entrelaza su carne con la ausencia. Comienza aquí por medio de palabras que no persiguen nada, que no valdrían nunca para nada, que no consiguen más que levantar una pequeña interrupción en el transcurso eterno de los días, para que en ella quepan mis carencias, mis obsesiones y renuncias. Ese compendio exasperante de estupideces y arbitrariedades al que llamamos personalidad. Comienza aquí, para que al leerla reces y tú también te salves.
Water cobwebs. This moment in which I begin a prayer to pray for me, for everything that soars and whose feelings are stirred, that contains a window, a God, a childhood that emerges when we least expect it, that passes by despair in search of hope, that in order to dream opens its arms and entwines its flesh with absence, starts here through words which have no point, which could never be worth anything, which manage only to cause a minor blip in the eternal passage of days, so that my wants may be fitted to it, my obsessions and renunciations, this exasperating compendium of stupidities and arbitrary acts, which we call personality, starts here, so that on reading it, you may pray, and you too be saved.
Finalmente, otro poema, finally another poem, also dedicated to a photograph, a picture. Pasa el agua. Si alguien tuviera la ocurrencia de hablar de su vacío ante el vacío, ante la nada en la que nada existe, allí donde no hay tiempo ni hay espacio, donde no existe el miedo ni modo alguno de nombrar lo que sucedería si algo sucediera, donde nada es audible ni visible, se volvería Dios. Si se me permitieran sugerencias, antes de edificar el universo, lo primero sería construir una ventana inmensa para que no existiese tanta distancia innecesaria. Quizá después, si se confirma que se permiten sugerencias, ¿acaso fuera interesante diferenciar más claramente la verdad de lo que es solo verosímil o simplemente falso? Tras desplegar galaxias y planetas, órbitas aptas para el desarrollo de la vida, tras estudiar el modo de acabar con la ceguera y la sordera, permítase que Dios se ocupe de que nunca falte el agua.
Speaking of their emptiness in the face of emptiness, if anyone had the bright idea of speaking of their emptiness in the face of emptiness, for the nothing in which nothing exists, there where there is no time and no space either, where there is no fear nor any way to name what might happen should anything happen, where nothing can be heard or seen, they would become God. Now, if I were allowed some suggestions before building the universe, the first thing would be to construct a vast window so there wouldn't be so much pointless distance. Later, perhaps, if it's confirmed that suggestions are allowed, maybe it would be interesting to tell apart more clearly the truth from what is merely probable or simply false. After unfolding galaxies and planets, apt orbits for the development of life, after studying how to do away with blindness and deafness, let it be allowed that God sees to it that water is never wanting.
Vamos con el siguiente. Let's go with the next poem dedicated to water. Agua. Mi primera memoria era flotar en las oscuridades de mi madre, cuando la vida era inmediatez, silencio de unas voces a lo lejos, preparativos y esperanza, listas con mis posibles nombres, mientras el agua era mi música, mi abrazo, una laguna íntima en la que mi sustancia diminuta, célula a célula, iba formándose despacio a través del cordón umbilical que me traía al nacimiento. Era tan nuevo el cuerpo mío que apenas transcurríamos el mundo y yo sin que creciera en mí un nuevo órgano que había que aprender a manejar deprisa para que el resto de mi cuerpo pudiera continuar incorporándose a mi pequeña cantidad, al archipiélago de sangre y huesos que floreció en el útero tan poco a poco. Por eso, al pronunciar tu nombre, agua, siento en la boca oscuridad y cercanía, recuerdo previo a la memoria. Eres mi juventud, la prehistoria de mi carne, la edad antigua y prístina a la que a veces sueño con volver, para que el sueño siga.
Across the umbilical cord. My first memory was of floating in the dark recesses of my mother, when life was immediacy, silence of some voices far away, making ready and expectations, lists with my possible names. While the water was my music, my embrace, an intimate lake in which my diminutive substance, cell by cell, was slowly being formed across the umbilical cord which drew me towards birth. This body of mine was such a novelty that hardly had the world and I happened, then there grew in me a new organ which I had to learn to handle fast, so the rest of my body could carry on being absorbed into my small quantity, to the archipelago of bones and blood which blossomed little by little in the womb. So, when I say your name, water, I taste in my mouth darkness and nearness, a souvenir before there was memory. You are my youth, the prehistory of my flesh, the ancient, pristine age which now and again I dream I'll go back to, so the dream may go on. When Alvaro also talked about some of the challenges of translating Spanish poetry into English, we felt we couldn't leave today's session without bringing in some of Alvaro's most recent work called Colonizada Corazón, Colonized Heart, which consists of a series of piropos. Now, for those of you who don't know the term piropo, a piropo is a kind of verbal catcall or wolf whistle, which is fairly common in some cultures in the Spanish-speaking world, particularly in Andalusia and in Latin America. And it's basically a comment or a kind of throwaway, flirtatious comment that a man, usually a man, makes to a woman, often in a public space. There's also a tradition of inscribing piropos on the backs of lorries in Argentina, so that the truck drivers, usually male, can give their piropos to the world as they drive through the highways of Latin America. Now, if you're an English translator of this particular form, I think that you probably feel, even though the form itself is quite, it's quite relaxed in some ways, it's quite upbeat or whatever, as a translator, you feel very much on your own in the culture that we live in, where this kind of text is regarded in a much different, perhaps much more suspicious way than it would be in a Latin or a Spanish-speaking culture. So in a sense, as translators, we feel quite exiled by writing these texts and trying to get them published. I have to say we've succeeded in getting none of these piropos published, partly, I think, because people say you can't write that thing in English these days. It's just sexist. Well, here we go. So here are some examples of piropos, and we're taking a risk here because this is an English, by and large, audience, some of them, so you may have distinct feelings about these piropos. But anyway, here they go. So we're going to start off with a longish one, and then we're going to do them in relays with Alvaro doing the Spanish, and I'll do the English.
But first of all, I want to speak on the etymology of the word piropo. It comes from Greek, as many of you will guess, as many other words in Spanish, also in English. The first part of the word is piros, which means fire, And the second one is ops, which has to do optical, which has to do with the eyes. So you see a beautiful girl and something burns inside your eyes, and that's a piropo, what you utter, what you say when you see someone who deserves it. And as Stephen said before, it is inside the Spanish culture and Hispanic culture, it's not considered sexist, I think. We should ask girls, but from men's point of view, we do not consider it to be sexist. First, we're going to read one of them. This was a series I wrote and I sent by SMS to Rocío, which is sat there, and so they were written and sent by SMS, so they are naturally short, of course, which is convenient for the piropo as well. You cannot say a girl 3 pages because she will think you are annoying. Cuando callábamos, los labios se nos unían en un discurso sin lenguaje, en una narración del horizonte donde el mutismo nuestro amanecía y se gastaba atravesando párrafos, edades, ríos. A veces se nos callaba incluso la respiración y era besarse entonces un exilio sigilosísimo en las fronteras de lo eterno.
When we stopped talking, our lips joined together in a speech without language, in a description of the horizon upon which dawned our tight-lippedness and spent itself crossing paragraphs, ages, rivers. Now and then even our breathing would be hushed, and to kiss then was the stealthiest exile on the borders of the eternal.
And now we're going to read a series of piropos, which are the oldest ones. When I wrote these piropos, I was still searching how to express this mood, how to express this state of mind, and this is why they are the shortest ones. They are dedicated, each one to a part of the women's body, and I apologize for the inconveniences. We're going to read it as Stephen said. The series is called Arquitecturas de tu Cuerpo. It's a play on words. It comes from architecture, of course, and text. We are going to build a text as if we were building a building. Inventaré un idioma con tu cuerpo para que mis labios te pronuncien.
I'll invent a language with your body so my lips can pronounce you.
Tus axilas tienen el misterio de los relojes abiertos.
Your armpits possess the mystery of opened timepieces.
El minotauro del silencio se durmió en tu oído.
The minotaur of silence nodded off in your ear.
Al mirarte las rodillas, comprendo los motivos del agua.
When I look at your knees, I grasp water's purposes.
Te cubriré las nalgas con pétalos de aire.
I'll cover your buttocks with petals of thin air.
Puse el oído sobre tu pecho para sentir el magma.
I placed my ear to your breast to sense the magma.
En tu vientre se escondían los urogallos.
In your belly, grouse were ensconced.
Hay en tus uñas 10 amaneceres.
In your nails, there are 10 dawns.
Les di a tus muslos mi melancolía para que me cantaran.
I gave your thighs my melancholy so they could chant to me.
En tus tobillos sueñan los minutos del hombre que son medusas a lo lejos.
In your ankles, the minutes of man dream, sea nettles from afar.
Mi boca busca el zumo de tus besos callados.
My mouth seeks the sap of your silent kisses.
¿Está tu pelo tan lleno de presagios?
Your hair is charged through and through with omens.
Tu piel, frontera entre dos mundos.
Your skin, the frontier between two worlds.
Son tus pestañas los navíos de tu mirada.
Your eyelashes are the liners of your glance.
Junto a tu frente espero.
Grazing your brow, I'm on standby.
He caminado siglos para mirarte el talle.
I've been striding centuries to look at your waist.
Converso con tus clavículas hasta que me olvido de mi tristeza.
I chat to your collarbones till I clean forget my blues.
La luz del terebinto caía sobre tus hombros.
The light of the mastic tree would fall on your shoulders.
Te veo con las manos para tocarte la alegría.
I see you by hand to touch you in your joy.
Es Ariadna la penumbra en el laberinto de tus orejas.
Ariadne is the half-light in the labyrinth of your ears.
La paz cabalgaba lentamente alrededor de tus pezones.
Peace went slowly riding around your nipples.
Mis ojos se derrumban en el silencio de tus brazos.
My eyes gave way in the silence of your arms.
Tus cejas tenían la claridad ornamental y lívida de los daguerrotipos.
Your eyebrows had the inky, ornate, clear-cutness of daguerreotypes.
¿Por qué es tu vientre una escalera para subir al tiempo?
Why is your belly a staircase for mounting time?
Tu lengua es del color de la ternura.
Your tongue is the colour of tenderness.
Sobre tu nuca quiso el sol ponerse alas de pájaro para sobrevolarte.
The sun would put on bird's wings about the back of your neck to flutter above you.
Al llegar a tu espalda, mis dedos aprenden a ser libres.
When they get to your back, my fingers learn how to be free.
This is a very difficult to translate one. Tu sien sentía siempre.
Your temple would sense all along.
Todo tu cuerpo es rostro.
All of your body's a face.
I said before that one of the poetry purposes must be to lengthen or to enlarge the reader's life. I think poetry is some kind of a medium between reality and the world and the reader's mind. So that if you want to live more, what you have to do is to read poetry, because your life is not going to be longer, but it's going to be more intense. And you will enlarge your experiences with the poet's experiences. So the next poem is called Escribiendo, Writing. And I write here about the experience of writing poems, right? Escribiendo. Para escribir poemas, en un principio no tenemos nada. Ante nosotros, el vacío. Un agujero negro tira del corazón y nos reclama lo que más queremos. Igual que si quisiera escribir a su vez otro poema hecho de silencio y no supiera cómo. Le doy al hueco mi mejor palabra, la que más amo, la que más me duele dar, esa que habita en mí desde pequeño, esa que vuela y hace que yo vuele, en cuanto la pronuncio.